Hi, my name is Hannah Kreider, and I'm doing the narration for the screencast for our group. We did structural analysis, and in our group there were Megan, Janet, myself, and Rachel. So I'm going to go briefly through this PowerPoint to kind of go over the broad overview, and then I'm going to show some examples of two different types of structural analysis called clausal analysis and discourse analysis. And then I'm going to go briefly over, if we have time, the activity that we're going to ask you all to do. Okay, so now, of course, I can't make the PowerPoint go. There we go. Okay, so overall, structural analysis is looking at the telling of the narrative rather than what is told in the narrative. So how does the narrator structure the telling of their narrative? And the benefit of structural analysis, or the point of it, is that we can gain insights beyond what we could gain from the referential meaning. So they might be talking about a certain content, and that can give us some understanding of their narrative and what the meaning is to them of that story. However, if we look at how they told the story, so what they said first, the pattern of how they say certain things, then that can help us understand even more about the narrative. And so the way this is done is by looking at really examining different types of narrative structure. Okay, so structural analysis is, here's some just different quotes. So it's tied to theorizing in narratology, identifying scientific rules of spoken language, and also looking at the deep and surface structures universal to speech. So obviously there's some language barriers here in terms of if you're looking at the rules of a spoken language such as English, that might not completely apply to another language. And Riessman talks a little bit about that as well. So in terms of the background, structural analysis began in the classroom. And so it was part of this movement in the United States to look at racial injustice in the classroom. So Shirley Bryce Heath, she looked at two groups of students in a classroom setting after desegregation, and one group was white and one group was black. And she looked at how they participated in show and tell. So really a narrative activity. How did they tell these stories? And she found that the children heard the stories differently, and they also told stories differently based on their race. And so Courtney Kasdan built on this, and she actually taught adaptive linguistic methods to teachers and had them tape classroom discussion and then play that back and talk with their students about what sort of problems were happening in the classroom. And this helped foster discussion about, if certain children were talking more or less, or, different ideas about that. So she said that children learned how to put into words what the public needed to understand, and they learned how to do that through brief exchanges with their teachers. So for example, one participant, black participant, said in this study, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something along the lines of, "I hated show and tell because the teacher kept interrupting me." Now the teacher was interrupting by doing these brief exchanges, trying to help that child learn how to construct a narrative in the mainstream, maybe more academically accepted way. However, what Kasdan looked at is that teachers were working more successfully with white children because of this narrative structure difference. And the idea being that we shouldn't look down on one narrative structure, but rather just understand the differences. So the black children would tell stories as these short episodes that were linked thematically. So there wasn't really a clear statement of the overall point or the time and place that started at the beginning. It was more like these short little vignettes that were all connected thematically. However, the teacher was expecting here's the point of my story, here's the beginning, the middle, and the end. And these children were not telling the stories that way. So the take-home message from this background is that the structure of the narrative impacts our understanding and tells us something about the narrator. That's sort of the underlying basis for structural analysis. So one benefit is that it allows topics and voices to be included in qualitative research that could be missing otherwise. A great example of this, I'll talk a bit more about later if we have time. James Gee and his work, he founded discourse analysis, which we'll talk about in a minute. But he looked at the narrative of a schizophrenic woman. And so in schizophrenia, we see really dissociative speech in terms of there's not really some clear pattern, sometimes it's nonsensical. But what he did was he really used structural analysis to look at, how this woman did not organize her narrative in a way that made sense from a from a traditional perspective. And so what he did was he really looked at what was she saying and how was she saying it, and that allowed him to understand actually the point and the meaning of her narrative. And so that's an example of a voice that could not be included in narrative usually, or in qualitative research, but using structural analysis, we can make sense of it, and it can actually become meaningful to the audience. So like I said, it focuses on how the content is organized. It's time consuming, which you'll find when you do our activity. We tried to keep it short for you so it won't be too time consuming. But that makes sense. It's not really suitable for large samples or even necessarily for an extremely long interview. But it can work for case studies and then comparisons across a few cases. So Riessman herself did some work on how do people talk about divorce. And she used structural analysis and found some differences in how men and women talked about divorce, how different people talked about divorce. And it just provides us these tools to understand how the participants construct their story. Okay, so this is the first type of analysis within structural analysis, and this is clausal analysis. I was initially a little confused about what clauses are, so I'll go into this in as much detail as I can in the short time. Some of you may know exactly what clauses are, but I haven't taken an English class for a very long time, so I was confused. The idea is that Leibov and Waletsky designed this model to look at these chunks of text. So you just divide the transcript into clauses, these chunks of text that are organized around some central verb or action. Then you look at the function of each clause. So what is the point of each one and how are they organized? And this will make sense on the next slide a little bit. And the idea being that people organize their clauses to convey stories in a certain way. So the 6 basic clause functions are included in most narratives. They don't all have them, and it's important to know that they'll be in different orders, and that's exactly what we're looking at in structural analysis, especially clausal analysis, is how are they organized. So we have the abstract, which is the summary point of the story. We have an orientation, so who, what, where, when, why, that kind of stuff. The complicating action, so what happens. The evaluation, which is where the narrator sort of steps back and reflects on the events. Then the resolution, so what happened. And then finally this coda, which is ending the story and bringing it back to the present. So let me show you an example of this. Okay, so this is from Riessman's study about divorce. Let me see if I can... Okay, so... Oh, sorry. Okay, so here she starts, and here on the side here are these different codes. So first she starts an abstract. That's where the pain is. I guess that's where the dream ended. So she's telling us the point of the story. Then she gives us some orientation about the number of years they've been married, where they were. Complicating action, her husband began having an affair with a parishioner. Okay, now we get back to orientation. So 25 years his junior. That's facts. That's more explanation of the facts of the matter. More complicating action, and then this evaluation, and that drove me literally nuts. So she's coming a little bit, she's removing herself a bit from the story to report on her own reflection. So that kind of continues here, and then at the end, here's the resolution. So he went to Greensville and started another affair, and the coda being this finishing up of the story, so, and that is still going on, and bringing it to the present. So it's currently going on. The idea being that you can learn something about how this particular person structures her narrative. Like, if we look at that, we can understand something about her and her experience. Okay, so I'm aware of time, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but it'll be uploaded for you. Like I said, this causal analysis can allow us to understand voices that we may not hear otherwise because they're not maybe traditionally academic. Another important thing to think about is that it can validate thematic analysis. So what that means is it can actually serve as a source of triangulation. So let's say we look at the content of what the person says in thematic analysis, we can sometimes triangulate what we are thinking the content is with how they're saying it. So for example, we'll look at in a moment a male divorcee, and the way that he talked about his feelings was he wasn't quite sure of them, and it's sort of this speeding up and then backing off, and speeding up and then backing off in terms of he feels his feelings and then he avoids them, and then he feels them and he avoids them. That pattern also occurred in the structure of the narrative. So it can be this means of triangulation for us. It also can help us understand the larger social historical discourse if we think about why is it that this person puts this narrative together in this certain way. Okay, so the next type of the next type of structural analysis is discourse analysis, where we analyze the units of discourse. So the difference here, the big difference to keep in mind, is that in this one we're listening for the change, we're listening for the meaning, rather than trying to read the meaning. And this will make more sense in a moment. So it's how a sequence of utterances is actually said. So, it includes these things like idea units, lines, stanzas, strophes, parts. So even as you're listening to me do the screencast, there's probably things you can tell I think are more important or less important, or you can infer some meaning just by my pitch and tone. And that's the idea behind this, developed by James Gee, that we listen to these different aspects of the audio. And that those are giving us some cues about how important the information is. Again, this has some language barriers in terms of it's based on the North American English system of stresses and voice pitch, so you couldn't necessarily apply it to some other language without, fully understanding that language. And like I said, this work was originally centered around this speech of a schizophrenic woman, and he found the meaning by really looking at the structure of her speech. So did she slow down before she started something? Did she speed up before she changed gears? And really analyzing how that sounded and what the meaning of it was. So intonation can help the listener determine breaks in the narrative, which then helps break it into stanzas. And then once you break it into stanzas of, the speaker talked a lot in this one moment and then pause, now we have a new stanza. We look at then what is the purpose of each stanza. So I'll show you the example in a minute, which will help it make more sense. And then it allows us to identify and include patterns that might reinforce the theme. Okay, so let's look at our transcript here. I apologize for this poor quality scanning, but this is from the book, so it's page 97 and 98 if you want to just look there. So this is this divorced man that I was talking about. So we see here that the way he was saying it is something like, I got a feeling that I'd never experienced before. A certain frantic feeling. Pause. Like I was running right on the edge, and I don't know on the edge of what. Pause. I was never able to put that into words very well. Pause. So we see that we break it into stanzas here on the side. And then what she also does is then she codes each stanza. So she looks at this first stanza and sees, okay, there's affect. He's talking about his feelings. Still talking about his feelings here. Then in this part where he pauses, then now he's backing off. So like I said, this is this idea that in the content he's talking about, he feels his feelings, then he backs off, and also in the structure of the narrative that happens as well. Okay, so hopefully that explains it a little more. One last thing is I'm going to just show the activity that we have here to sort of go over what you're going to do. So we have a transcript from a very, very brief narrative from a Somalian refugee, and we want you to analyze it in two ways. So doing the causal analysis and the discourse analysis, both structurally, and then think about what was it like to use different methods? Did you learn certain things in different ones? Which one did you like? All those sort of good reflection questions. So the first one is that causal analysis. So these are your codes here that hopefully you'll be able to use and apply to this narrative. What I would recommend doing is actually going into the narrative itself and deciding, let's say you decide this is a clause. So you would actually separate them out in here. So I'll upload it in a Word document so that it's easier to do that. And then for the discourse analysis, since that's based on actual speech, you're going to have to click on this YouTube link and actually listen to it. And then you're going to, also kind of go through, and here's the transcript again, so you can analyze it that way. And then last, we're just going to ask you to reflect and post in the discussion board about, what you learned and how they were different or similar. So that's it. I know that was a quick and dirty way to get into structural analysis. I hope that it made sense. Please feel free to post any questions. We would love to answer them as a group. And hopefully you got something out of this. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye.